All right, everybody, welcome to this previously unscheduled virtual weather and climate office hour. The one that I was really hoping I wouldn't have to have, but here we are. Apologies for the echo here. I just need to turn my own talking off in another window. Uh, Well, the day that a lot of folks in the weather and climate enterprise, in the public and private sector, had been fearing might come has now officially arrived. And despite many assurances from some that there would in fact not be cuts at NOAA or the Weather Service, or that if there were, there'd be widespread public safety exemptions, or that if there weren't, there would still be plenty of people to staff all of the critical mission-aligned and life-saving roles. Well, that is not in fact what happened today, when apparently at least hundreds and potentially as many as a couple of thousand employees in an agency that's only composed of about 11,000 people nationally were summarily fired for no given reason other than a presumptively inaccurate one, which is that all of them were underperforming. This, ironically, extends to, and in fact particularly focused on, a lot of employees who had recently received performance-based promotions to new roles, which was why they were in the class of quote-unquote probationary employees. I do think it's worth reminding everybody again that probationary employee, if you're a federal agency staff member, is not what it sounds like. In some settings, probationary might mean you weren't doing a very good job at your role, perhaps, and were on notice to get better or else. That is not what it means in the context of the federal government. Probationary employees are generally one of two things in almost all circumstances. They are either relatively recent hires, so people have been hired by the federal government within the past 1 to 3 years, depending on the agency and the role. It varies somewhat, but you're automatically a probationary employee if you've been hired recently. So anybody they've hired out of college, out of graduate school, and anyone they've poached from the private sector or anywhere else, all of them in all federal agencies are classified as probationary. Also, anybody who receives a major performance-based promotion, so if they've done very well at their job for decades, perhaps, as is the case with many people who are fired today, and they receive an offer for a new supervisory or administrative role or an elevated scientific role, they become newly probationary once again for the first 1 to 3 years of their new role that they received, ironically, as a result of excellent and exceptional performance over the years. So what has happened today is that at NOAA, and yes, including at the National Weather Service, which is an agency housed within NOAA, what has occurred is that the very most experienced employees in many places, as well as all of the new employees who had recently been hired to replace people who were aging out or retiring or just moving on to the private sector, were summarily fired with 1 hour or less of notice. People were informed to clear out their desks and be out of the building within a few minutes. That was the level of notice that was received. And despite many reassurances, again, in recent hours, even ironically in the hours leading up to this, there were reassurances that National Weather Service meteorologists, the people responsible for maintaining the public safety from weather and weather-related hazards in this country, would be exempted under a public safety exemption. That did not happen. I can confirm that there were numerous meteorologists and hydrologists and other people who create severe weather warnings and flood warnings and disseminate them to the public who were let go within the past few hours at the National Weather Service. Most of whom, again, were either probationary, meaning that they were relatively recent hires, people who were hired essentially to account for the fact that there were already pre-existing staffing shortages in many of these locations, people who worked in the National Weather Service field offices. So these are the people who are responsible for creating your personal day-to-day weather forecast. And also some of the most senior people who had been there for a really long time and were doing a really good job. So this is very clearly not what you want to do if you want to quote unquote trim the fat. This is what you want. This is what you would do if you want to purposefully kneecap a well-functioning public agency. It's really impossible at this point to see it as anything other than that. So I don't have the specifics of the numbers. In fact, even the journalists I've been speaking to this evening, nobody really knows exactly the full extent of it, and it sounds like there are actually still additional firings going out. People are getting the dreaded email in their inbox as the 5 p.m. hour approaches locally. So apparently they've rolled these out at 5 p.m. in each time zone. Currently it's 5:30 Mountain Time, so there may still be some additional firings to come on the West Coast within the hour. But this is pretty serious stuff. Now, there's been lots of other serious stuff going on in terms of what the federal government is or isn't doing in recent weeks, but this, I think, is crossing another line that a lot of people, even who had been not so concerned about some of the other mass firings and personnel decisions that have been made in the past few weeks, were even folks who were relatively nonplussed by those are now quite alarmed by these ones. And I think it's because it was viewed that there is so much bipartisan support in many circles for the National Weather Service, for example. It's a very highly respected organization within government, within NOAA, in the public and private sector. Everybody I know who works in the weather and climate sector on the private side of things also recognizes the indispensable and critical importance of the National Weather Service and its associated agencies. It's internationally respected. It's respected by governors, by mayors, and blue states and red states together. And so I think there had been the view that surely we won't cut something that is so immensely successful, so immensely critical, and also just frankly widely popular among the American people, among American politicians, and here we are. So I think this is maybe a litmus test for some folks about what's really going on here. That isn't really the focus of my conversation I wanted to have today, though. What I really want to do is talk about what has potentially been lost and what might be to come and how we can potentially prevent further losses depending on how things evolve moving forward. So first of all, I want to say to my colleagues at NOAA and the Weather Service that I'm very sorry this is happening, and I think that it does say something about the work that you've been doing, that this particular round of firings is the one that seems to be triggering a lot of folks to pretty significant anger and action. Hopefully action more than anger, because that's more constructive. But I do think it says something about the work that you've been doing and something about the importance of that work at a societal scale, that there was immediately a huge response and immediately backlash to these decisions, even as they were actively unfolding in people's inboxes, even as people were being escorted out of Weather Service offices and NOAA federal buildings. And what's remarkable about this is that it really transcends virtually all job descriptions in NOAA. I've heard from folks in the fisheries division who have been fired today, folks in hydrology who either design or implement river flow models, for example, including folks responsible for mapping out whether your house is going to flood in that big atmospheric river storm coming or not. Just to be clear, I'm not talking about any specific storm that's coming. I'm just talking in generalities here. It also includes the Weather Service meteorologists who are literally responsible for developing the forecast that you see if you go to weather.gov, but that ultimately forms the backbone of, frankly, most of what you see on your weather apps, what you see on TV, all of the widely consumed weather information through the private sector relies on this NOAA backbone. The people who issue tornado warnings and flash flood warnings, the people who issue red flag warnings, like the one in Los Angeles, the particularly dangerous situation warning that warned Angelenos and Southern Californians of the historically critical wildfire conditions prior to those devastating fires in LA. These are the people who issue those warnings. These are the people who have the connections to make sure the right people hear those warnings and take preemptive actions to protect life and property. These are the people who essentially prevent weather disasters from being much worse than they are in this country. And so, even beyond that, today, most of the new hires, and there were, by the way, very many new hires because there was a lot of work to be done in the division of NOAA that maintains and improves our American weather model. So the Global Forecast System, or GFS, for those of you who are more on the weather geek side of things and hear me in my regular office hours and on the Weather West blog talking about the American model. Well, that's who builds that model and maintains it. Guess what? A lot of those folks just got removed from their job duties. So there will be real-world effects of this. There will be local Weather Service field offices who do not have enough personnel to maintain their duty, their congressionally mandated duty to protect life and property during extreme weather events. That is the inevitable reality here, because many of these offices were already understaffed, and now they've had some of that critical staff removed. In addition, there's a hiring freeze in effect, so they cannot bring on anyone new. They can only remove people. Further, there are credible, I guess we could call them rumors, but frankly at this point, all of these previous rumors have turned out to be true eventually from these same sources, so we'll call them credible information that much larger further cuts are yet in the pipeline. This would be known as a reduction in force, RIF. And these would affect people well beyond the probationary period or people who have recently been promoted, and essentially extend to virtually anybody of administrators' choosing. Cuts that are ostensibly planned to be on the order of 30 to 50%. 30 to 50% at NOAA and the National Weather Service. And again, there were previously assurances that no positions that were life safety critical or mission critical would be cut, but that's already, well, there's a few words for it, but it's clearly not true. Clearly not what's going to happen. Moving forward, I'll be really clear about what would happen with a 30 to 50% reduction, at least within the Weather Service. It would cease to function. We would no longer have a functioning National Weather Service, full stop. And so I don't think we should say, surely that won't happen, surely they can't do that, surely that's not desirable. That would be like shooting yourself in the foot. Well, that sure seems to be the path that we're on right now. And I actually just wrote up very quickly, hopefully there aren't too many typos in it, a statement for public consumption. I had a ton of journalists reaching out to me. There's no way I could respond to all of them in the 5 to 15 minutes before a lot of the deadlines went out this evening. I know some of you have joined this conversation right now, and I will be looking at the comments momentarily to answer as many questions from journalists and others as I can, but I do want to read that statement out loud because I did take the time to draft it, and hopefully it still sounds all right when I speak it aloud is when I wrote it. But let me just pull that up. So I can read it. And again, if you want a written copy of this, I have now posted a screenshot of this statement on all social media platforms that I'm on, as well as breaking it up into a thread. So a few folks noted that the alt text wasn't working because it was only showing the first 1,000 characters, so I then reposted the whole text as just a text-only thread for those who need that kind of accessibility. But let me just read this, and I will be reading off the screen, so my eyes may drift a bit, but here goes. The mass firing of both new hires and recently promoted senior staff within NOAA, including mission-critical and life-saving roles at the National Weather Service, is profoundly alarming. It appears that NOAA staff fired today include meteorologists, data and computer scientists responsible for maintaining and upgrading weather predictive models, and also technicians responsible for maintaining the nation's weather instrumentation network, among many others. Housed within NOAA, the U.S. National Weather Service is a truly world-class meteorological predictive service, perhaps singularly so in an international context. Its cost of operation is only $3 to $4 per year per taxpayer, equivalent to a single cup of coffee, and yields a truly remarkable return on investment, at least a 10 to 1 and perhaps a 100 to 1 ratio, depending on the method of estimation. NOAA and the National Weather Service collectively offer tens to hundreds of billions of dollars each year in net economic benefit through a combination of averted losses and also efficiencies gained. More importantly, the National Weather Service, which is itself supported by auxiliary services and entities throughout NOAA and elsewhere in the federal government, saves countless lives by continuously issuing high-quality weather forecasts and extreme weather warnings. There have been multiple cases, in fact, just in the past several years, where Weather Service predictions and real-time emergency warnings have objectively saved hundreds, perhaps even thousands of lives during a single event. Despite widespread discussion to the contrary, the fact of the matter is that the private sector as it presently exists simply cannot spin up to fill any void left by substantial dismantling of NOAA and or the National Weather Service. I work extensively with weather and climate scientists who work in the private sector, all of whom do good and important work that I greatly respect. Yet even within the private sector, there is near unanimous agreement that NOAA and the National Weather Service are indispensable. In fact, though this is not widely known outside of weather and climate science circles, most or all of the private weather companies in the United States, including all of the weather forecasts that you see on TV news or your favorite weather app, are built directly atop the backbone of taxpayer-funded instrumentation, data assimilation, predictive modeling, and forecasting services provided by NOAA and the National Weather Service. They simply could not exist if NOAA and the Weather Service did not function as it presently does. Further, even a temporary or partial interruption in NOAA's 24/7, 365 life-saving services, which are often used in an hour-by-hour, even minute-by-minute context during extreme weather events and other emergencies, would be devastating. The National Weather Service is a critical public utility, and it would be extremely difficult to rebuild if torn down. This is not, in short, an acceptable setting in which to, quote, move fast and break things. End quote. I want to be clear, if there were to be large staffing reductions at NOAA and the National Weather Service, as appears is now indeed underway, with credible reports of much larger further cuts on the horizon, there will be people who die in extreme weather events and weather-related disasters who would not have otherwise. The American economy would also suffer. The now confirmed and rumored additional cuts to come at NOAA and the Weather Service are spectacularly short-sighted and will ultimately deal a major self-inflicted wound to the public safety of Americans and the resiliency of the American economy to weather and climate-related disasters. So I guess that's a bit of a lengthier statement than I realized at first glance, but in any case, I think it does summarize certainly how I feel, my mixed, professionally informed personal opinion, let's call it that. And I think the challenge is that this is probably not the last cut. This is probably not the last culling of critically needed federal expertise we're going to see in the weeks and months to come. And so, again, I don't relish having these conversations. These are my least favorite kind of YouTube live streams. I'd much rather be talking about the science. I'd much rather be talking about the fact that today was the warmest February day on record in parts of California. It was in the 80s and 90s in some places in late February. But instead, here we are, and I'm talking about something that I know a lot of folks would rather not hear about. But the reality is we are getting to the point that my personal ability to have conversations about weather and climate in real time are starting to be affected by what's going on in the federal government with these staffing levels. And of course, that's not the primary reason to care about it. The reason to care about it is everything I just mentioned. But what I'm trying to articulate here is that I don't really see that there's much of an option but to address this head on in this moment, because what we're careening toward is a situation where the ability of the American public sector to do good things, to protect life and property, and to do basic, essentially to engage in basic functionality that most nations have and the nations that don't have wish they did, where we seem to be on track to intentionally decimate it. A self-inflicted decapitation strike is certainly what it feels like. It is not rational in the name of efficiency. I'm certainly not going to sit here and defend every line item expenditure in the federal government. It's neither my expertise, nor is it my role, nor frankly would I really be able to do so in a justifiable way. I am 100% certain, as I've mentioned before, that there are inefficiencies in the federal government. And frankly, I don't really think that anybody, including federal employees, would argue with that. I don't even necessarily think that every single role that exists in the federal government is critically important. I do wish that we could reallocate a lot of our funds, although that veers dangerously into personal opinion territory as to how those allocations should look like. But what I think this is, what we're getting to now, is a really clear indication that the goal here is not efficiency, it's not cutting waste, it's not increased transparency, but it really does appear to be almost exactly the opposite of that. Certainly the effect is the opposite of that, but the intent, I don't particularly enjoy trying to divine the intent, but at this point I think it's pretty obvious. I think I would have to be ignoring pretty clear indications of what's really going on here, which is that there is a great desire to try and dismantle public agencies so that they can be resurrected, ostensibly as private sector ones, as companies, to shift the burden of protecting the public, of improving life for Americans to the private sector. There are so many problems with that supposition at the scale that we're seeing it right now. It's not to malign folks who work in the private sector at all, or to say that there aren't inefficiencies in the public sector, or even to say that there aren't many important things that I do believe the private sector probably could do better, quicker, more efficiently, and maybe even cheaper, although that last one is a little bit questionable. But I do think that there are many opportunities, including in the Weather Service and NOAA, for synergies between the public and private sector, greater ones than we've explored historically. And again, I think that's a view shared by almost everybody within NOAA and the private sector, so I don't think it's particularly controversial either. I do believe that there are situations where there are frustratingly inefficient processes. There are multiple layers of bureaucracy that even the bureaucrats who administer those bureaucracies, I think, are themselves frustrated with. So the ironic thing here is that I think there was a way to do this that could have actually cut some waste, that could have increased efficiency, that could have increased morale among federal agencies and public employees. But this isn't that. This appears to, this is certainly having the opposite effect. And at this point, it's hard to see what the intent is other than to purposefully make it harder for public servants to do the good work that they've been doing. So, and just to be clear, I have heard specifically from people who have been fired. So this is not speculation. There are news reports, and I've heard from people who have gotten their termination papers, who were told that they were terminated because their performance had been poor. And once again, this includes some people who have been hired within the past 2 weeks, who hadn't even actually started their job roles yet because they hadn't yet received their federal work devices, their computers and their phones and things like that. So I'll occasionally call bullshit when I see it, and this is certainly one of those cases. So I want to take a time to take a look at the comments here, since I know that there are going to be folks asking questions. I know there's some journalists here. And again, I'm sorry we're having this conversation. I really don't want to be having it. But again, I think the recent events have sort of forced the issue. So let me take a sip of water, and then we dive into the comments here. Drew mentions that this is bad, but it could get worse. How many eligible for retirement will just say, I'm done? And that could be down the road in a few months. In addition, there's still a hiring freeze. All of this is true. And I will tell you that the morale within virtually all federal agencies is through the basement and crashing through the floor below the basement. There are people who are starting to consider leaving on their own accord because it is such a chaotic situation where every day you don't know if you're going to have your job tomorrow, receiving harassing emails from the Office of Personnel Management telling people that they're essentially worthless and low productivity. These were mass emails sent out to most or all of the federal workforce. Constant requests for trivial justifications of actions and expenditures. Micromanagement to the nth degree. And in many cases, it's not even clear for these folks how to comply with some of these new mandates and requests because most of their supervisors in the chain of command have been moved around or fired or have been banned from speaking with employees outside of their level of administrative status. So there is mass confusion. There is widespread demoralization. And there is going to be workforce attenuation beyond those folks who've been fired, beyond those who've been let go, because there is so much personal, professional, financial uncertainty in staying as a public employee right now that I think other folks are looking for potentially for other options. So there is going to be massive brain drain from some of the most internationally renowned agencies, research labs, departments, and etc. We're already seeing that unfold now. All right, I have a question from Madeline, San Francisco Chronicle, or SFGate. How could potential firings in California Weather Service offices impact us here, given our extreme weather events in recent years? Well, I don't know at this time the extent to which the firings have specifically affected either the Western Region office, which would sort of be the regional administrative office for the offices, the field offices in California, or for any of the local offices in California. And it's worth enumerating which Weather Service field offices specifically are directly involved in California. And I'll list them right now. There's the one in Eureka. There's the one in Medford, Oregon, which covers parts of Northern California. There's the one in Reno, Nevada, which covers portions of Eastern and Northeastern California. There's one in Sacramento. There's one in Monterey, serving the San Francisco Bay Area. One in Hanford, serving the San Joaquin Valley and Southern Sierra. One in Oxnard, primarily serving the Central Coast and the LA area. One in San Diego, serving southwestern California and the San Diego area, and then also offices in Las Vegas, Nevada, serving the southeastern deserts of California, as well as Yuma, Arizona, the far southern deserts of California. So there's a lot of regional field offices potentially involved. I don't know specifically what's happening in any of them, but many of these offices are already experiencing staffing shortages. And the problem is that staffing shortages at a local Weather Service field office may be manageable under ordinary conditions, but specifically become a problem under exceptional weather conditions when there is adverse or extreme weather, because there are lots of additional things you need to do. You need to keep eyes on radar at all times. You need to keep eyes on surface observations. You need folks in direct communication with offices of emergency services and mayor's offices and fire departments and county sheriff's offices, as the case may be. You also have to field questions from the media and the general public and people who are out on fishing boats and any number of different. These are the constituents of National Weather Service meteorologists, if you will. So under normal circumstances, if you're on the midnight shift and it's quiet weather at 2 a.m., it's not as much of a problem generally if you're short a person or two. But imagine it's an extreme weather day and there's 6 or 7 people in the office and you really need 30 people. And now all of a sudden, because of staffing cuts, you actually only have 5 people. That's going to cause problems. And it may mean that meteorologists are put in a really difficult position where they're trying their best and they're still not able to keep up. They may still miss things. And that, first of all, will be a personally terrible feeling for those meteorologists who might miss a severe weather event, a tornado on the radar screen or something, or a flash flood warning that should have been issued because there's just so much demand, not enough people to go around. That's a real risk. Or not able to provide as rapid decision support for fire crews under extreme fire conditions who are trying to decide a plan of action. These are all hypotheticals, but they are things that could start to happen once staffing levels are reduced. And again, I don't know specifically how much Weather Service staffing has been reduced in California or not. The other problem is that at a national level, the NOAA offices in Maryland, which are primarily where the weather models that are run to produce predictions for the whole country that the local meteorologists around the country then use locally, they fired a bunch of the folks who are responsible for maintaining those models and improving them. So one consequence is that those models are probably going to stop getting better, so the American model will continue to fall behind relative to the now superior European model. But also, it may just, at times, either the models themselves may break or the data flow from those models to the data centers and outward to the public and to Weather Service offices. That pipeline could fail because they fired a lot of the IT people as well. So if that happens, then local Weather Service offices, even if they're properly staffed, might be working partially in the dark. Same thing, they fired radar technicians. So what happens if a radar site goes down? We don't have redundant radar coverage in most of the country. In most places, there is a single weather radar site, a Doppler radar site that covers a given region. And if it goes down, you don't have weather radar coverage for sometimes days or even weeks. And that's under current conditions. Now we've lost some of the personnel and expertise to fix that equipment when it goes down. So what's going to happen if there's a tornado outbreak and the weather radar has been down for a few days? It's very difficult to make accurate tornado warnings without radar, for example, or accurate flash flood warnings. So you can see where this could go off the rails pretty quickly. It's a question, Daniel, what advice would you give to recent PhD atmospheric scientists on science careers now? I found a state job, but every place I've been looking is now massively being cut, so it's hard to discern the future. Yeah, I mean, that is another challenge, is that this is on top of being a major public safety crisis and a crisis of scientific integrity and credibility. It is also a real blow to American science. The same blow, by the way, has already happened due to cuts at the NIH and the CDC and all of these health and epidemiology and biomedical related agencies in the federal government. The same thing happened there a week or two ago, where this has thrown lots of careers into turmoil. Some universities have stopped accepting PhD students completely in the past couple of weeks because of the level of turmoil right now in agencies that would otherwise be providing a large amount of the funding for new scientists, for new biomedical scientists, for new climate scientists, for new meteorologists. So this is a tough time. I think for those of you who are on the job market now and have advanced degrees in this space, master's or PhD degrees, there are a growing number of private sector jobs on the market. Not nearly enough, probably not even enough by a factor of 10, maybe even 100 to accommodate everybody who's just been fired across agencies. But there are maybe more than folks realize. I currently have a thread on LinkedIn. I'm not that active there, but I do have a presence there where a bunch of potential employers are sharing job listings, information, contact information regarding currently extant roles in the private sector with respect to wildfire modeling or weather or climate science. So I'll do what I can to connect folks. Check out that thread. There's also some people who've been posting on my other social media threads on other platforms regarding job opportunities. I'm also hearing that from certain hiring managers and CEOs at different companies in this space that they are going to try and rapidly scale up their hiring to pick up some of the folks who've recently been fired by the federal government. I think what's frustrating about this is it's very clear that the private sector does not believe that these employees have been fired for cause. Otherwise, why would you be willing to pay somebody twice their public sector salary as a private sector employee to do the same work unless you thought that they were going to be quite worthwhile at twice the salary? But that's in fact exactly what I'm hearing from a lot of folks. The problem is that's not going to work for everybody because there simply aren't enough private sector jobs to fill the massive void. And part of the problem is that a lot of the role of folks working in the public sector isn't to generate profitable enterprise. It's to help people, which often doesn't make a lot of money, and it's why it's a primary role of government to do it, because the private sector doesn't really have an explicit reason to protect life and property unless it protects the shareholder bottom line. And that's not even a cynical statement about corporations or money or anything. It's just a factual statement about what are corporations directly incentivized to do in the free market, and it is not to protect people's lives at all costs. That is the mandate, though, of federal agencies that we're dismantling. And so I think the problem is if the government doesn't do it, it's not clear that anybody is going to do it. So to folks who are in the field, I know it's a tough moment, and it may unfortunately get tougher in the weeks and months to come. There are a growing number of jobs in the private sector, and there will probably be an even greater number of jobs directly in response to what's happening right now. So I would say stick with it. There are people who are looking out. There are going to be opportunities. And some folks probably won't be able to do exactly what they were doing. And that, I think, is a bit of a travesty, because scientists, for those of you on this call who are scientists, you'll understand that you spend a pretty big part of your life focusing on something fairly specific, and you become an expert in that specific area. And you're really good at it. And you might love it, you might not love it, but you become highly specialized. More so than a lot of folks in other sectors at whatever it is you do specifically. And you become kind of attached to it. I know a lot of scientists, their personal identities are perhaps more than they should be attached to that specific domain niche that they fill. And sometimes what happens in moments like these is those folks are forced to pivot to something else. Most scientists have good data and analysis skills. They have good team building or team integration skills. Often good communication skills, not always, of course. These are obviously things that are valuable beyond science, and so it certainly would be possible for folks who are so inclined to get work doing something else, but using some of those same core skills. But the problem is, I think from a societal perspective, is that when that happens, when people are forced for practical reasons, because at some point you need to pay the rent, you need health insurance, people take the jobs that they can get, we lose that societally valuable specialized expertise. And I'm afraid that's what's going to happen, that there will be significant brain drain. I already know people who are leaving the US science field for Europe. So there are a number of countries in Western and Central Europe that are aggressively hiring, as is China right now, in exactly the same spaces that the US is ceding a lot of its historical edge. And so there will be more opportunities internationally. There will be more opportunities in the private sector. So I do think that opportunities will arise, but we're getting to the point where there's a mismatch in two respects. One, with the number of jobs that are going to be available in the space, and also a mismatch where that ultimately a lot of these private sector jobs, worthwhile and interesting and potentially better paid though they may be, they aren't necessarily going to protect the American public in the same way that being a public servant, being a meteorologist, being a hydrologist, being a wildland firefighter would. So that's sort of what I'm struggling with in this moment. But there are options out there. There are options in the research and science and public sector in other countries currently. And my hope is that this won't be the permanent state of things. But I am concerned that through this rapid disintegration, we are breaking things that are not going to be easy or quick to fix, even if we try to do so. The problem is already there is irreparable harm being done. Even if tomorrow a lot of these firings were reversed, a lot of the harm that has happened in the last few hours would remain, even if tomorrow everyone was invited to return. Partly because not everybody would, but secondly, because some workflows have already been greatly disrupted. So this is really a challenging moment for a lot of folks. Exactly. And I mentioned this. Uh, this is putting a lot of people who are remaining in the Weather Service and other federal agencies in a really tough spot, because if you're one of relatively fewer people remaining to do your life-saving work, that even more greatly increases the pressure to do it under even more difficult circumstances, and raises the stakes and raises the odds that someone will make a mistake. This is the great fear with air traffic control, the FAA, for example. That's another incredibly high pressure, high stress job that requires a lot of specialized training. It's not science, but it requires hugely specialized training, and people work under sort of almost unbelievably stressful conditions during long shifts for long careers, for decades in many cases. And that's another case where a single slip up can lead to a really bad outcome. We've seen what happens recently. And so, I do liken, in a tornado outbreak, a Weather Service meteorologist is filling a role not unlike that of an air traffic controller at a major international airport. You really can't mess up even once without bad things happening potentially to a lot of people. And the more the more stress you have, the less support you have, the fewer people working and checking and sort of adding redundancies to the system that you have, eventually the weak links are going to show themselves. Eventually, you might get away with it for a while, but eventually things will break down and bad things will happen. Last time I mentioned that, by the way, I started getting a lot of death threats. And that was apparently because a lot of folks were of the belief that this was a threat, that somehow the Weather Service or I personally was going to cause bad things to happen as punishment for having a particular ideology, which of course is not what I'm saying, and I'm not even quite sure how that would work unless either I or Weather Service meteorologists personally controlled the weather in some way. But in any case, this is the last thing that anyone wants to see happen. There's no air traffic controller saying, well, I hope something bad happens so I can say, I told you so. Literally no one. No air traffic controller is going to say that. No meteorologist is going to say, oh, I hope there's a really bad tornado outbreak or flash flooding event where lots of people fail to get timely warnings because, that'll sure show them. That's literally zero chance that anyone in the Weather Service is going to have that philosophy. So I think it's a real misread on the dedication of public servants, and also just the importance and the seriousness with which these folks take their jobs. I think it really does a disservice to characterize it in any other way. There's a question: will this have an impact on air safety? I know I've been talking about air traffic control as an analogy, but will these direct NOAA and Weather Service actions have implications for air safety? They certainly could, and I mean, it's difficult to predict. There are multiple layers of redundancy, usually in air travel, which is good, but and there are airlines do have their own private meteorologists. They have their own weather departments. Airports usually have some of their own meteorological capabilities. But the reality is, all of those, as I mentioned, all of those private weather entities, whether it's one associated, contracted with an airline, or the in-house meteorologist at an airline, or folks working at an airport, or coordinating with the FAA, they're still using this backbone data that's coming from NOAA. And so if that data is compromised or not forthcoming or not available in a timely fashion, then yes, that would threaten air travel safety. I mean, it's a hypothetical, but I don't think it's an absurd hypothetical. It is, and sometimes it's not even the obvious stuff. It's not don't fly through a hurricane. Okay, that's usually easy enough to avoid. But sometimes it's something very subtle. If you're a pilot or you're familiar with some of the weather hazards in aviation, one of the scariest things is something as mundane as icing on aircraft wings or the control surface of an aircraft. So just the incremental accumulation of solid ice, and that can happen summer or winter under different conditions and different types of clouds. So that's a really important element where you got to get the details right, and it's not something you can necessarily discern from observations on the ground or from satellites. It's really something you need specialized expertise to predict for and good weather model data to represent. So just one specific example of the kind of risks that might pose. So there's a question from Patrick about the effect on students and early career meteorologists. I sort of answered that one in response to another question earlier. I think it's tough because this is a moment of rapid change and great uncertainty. I don't really think we know exactly where we're going to end up here. In the very short term, I think the prospects of being hired by the federal government to do anything weather or climate related are very low, unfortunately, and a lot of recent hires have already been fired, and then some not so recent hires might be fired in the near future. So now, there is a public sector beyond the federal government, and I actually expect that individual states might be scaling up, especially in response to this, in fact. So there will probably be both a burgeoning private sector and also a burgeoning non federal public sector in the US, so at the state, regional, county level, depending on your particular area of expertise, and then also internationally too. There will be opportunities. But in the next few months, it's going to be really hard to figure out exactly what that landscape looks like. It will look also different for folks with advanced degrees, PhDs, and master's degrees versus bachelor's degrees. And I think that's maybe where a lot of the frictions is going to exist. Is where exactly do folks go who are sort of newly minted scientists who want to be weather forecasters or hydrologists or fire weather experts, wildfire modelers, and I will follow up later. But again, I would encourage folks to check out that thread that I have recently posted on LinkedIn, where there's a fair number of employers who are reaching out. You can either reach out to them, go to their job websites, but in terms of folks looking to become public servants, as I know a lot of people do in this space because they feel that it's important. I think we're kind of in wait and see mode in terms of what happens to the Weather Service, what happens to NASA, what happens to NOAA more broadly, what happens to the National Science Foundation, what happens to universities, what happens to government research labs. I know my colleagues at NSF NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, are very anxious right now about what might happen next. There have already been major cuts, for example, that even before this week affected the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And there's just a lot of uncertainty right now, and I wish I could read the crystal ball and predict that future, but that's even harder than predicting the weather, unfortunately, at this moment. Could states like California fund their own public weather service, do you think? Well, I mean, in a certain sense, you could not replicate something like the National Weather Service precisely because it operates at essentially national and international scales. So in that sense, probably not. NOAA and the National Weather Service jointly with NASA operate, multiple Earth orbiting satellites. Hundreds of radar stations, thousands of weather instrumentation stations. They operate the flagship American weather models. I mentioned the GFS, which is run on supercomputers, as well as other shorter term, high resolution weather models that you sometimes hear me mention on this channel. So, I guess I would never say never, but the problem is creating something like that from scratch would be really, really hard and time consuming incredibly expensive, logistically very difficult, and it's not entirely clear how you would get it to work without buy-in from all of these other entities from around the country and around the world. Maybe you could get that. It's an interesting idea. I don't see any opportunity for that in the short term, but I do wonder if potentially a state like California might actually try and do something like this in the long run. That, this is not something that could happen within the year or probably within even a couple of years. If we continue down the path we're currently on, might we see it? Sort of the nation state of California sort of try and replicate some of these critically important public services that were maybe. But that's speculative. It's an interesting idea, though. But there are major practical challenges to making that happen, because what would it mean is a state like California would then have to operate its own large fleet of satellites, potentially, its own fleet of Doppler radar sites, its own in-house weather model run on its own supercomputers. Not impossible. California is a big state. It's got a lot of resources. It's an innovative state. There's a lot of tech and science expertise and a lot of money potentially available to do it. So it's an interesting idea. I would be somewhat surprised if it happened, but we live in pretty dramatic and changeable times, so we'll see what happens. There's a comment about specific NOAA staff being targeted for firing. I don't know the details. Again, all this has happened in the last few hours, and I've been pretty much wall-to-wall busy with some of the response. So I don't know all the details. It's quite possible folks in the comment section know some more of the details than I do. But from what I'm hearing, essentially most of the firings that have been made are clearly under false pretenses, because some of the stated reasons are not physically possible. Essentially, poor performance over the past year, for example, for people who have been hired within the past 2 weeks would be a pretty specific example. Or alternatively, poor performance over the past year by career employees who have been there for 20 to 30 years who were recently promoted due to exceptional performance into a new role, also purportedly being fired for quote-unquote poor performance. So I think it's just pretty self-evident that that's just not correct. There's a good question from Amanda. Yeah, could you talk some about the consequences of pauses in monitoring, like the Weather Service balloon launches? So these are known as radiosondes, and they're really important pieces of information because they give a vertical profile of the atmosphere. So these are literally weather instruments that are attached to a large helium balloon issued at critical locations all around the Earth at coordinated times, either twice or 4 times daily, depending on the context. So those balloons will rise with those instruments up all the way into the stratosphere before they pop. They fall back to Earth. Sometimes people return them to the Weather Service office. Sometimes they don't. But that provides essentially a 3D view of the atmosphere that is critical for accurate weather predictions. It's so critical, in fact, that in advance of known major weather events, like a tornado outbreak in the Midwest or a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico or something, Weather Service in the U.S. will order local offices to increase the frequency of their balloon launches. They don't do them all the time because they're kind of expensive, but it's clearly viewed that increasing the frequency during known periods of extreme weather coming up are critically important. And as you might expect, they mainly do it upwind of the extreme weather event. So there might be an ask for weather offices along the west coast of the U.S. to start increasing the frequency of their radiosonde launches, for example, if there might be a severe weather outbreak in the central U.S. in spring, because you want to know what's coming down the pike, what's upwind of the storm region. So these are clearly of critical importance. If there is an interruption in these, it will immediately, within hours, so the same day, degrade extreme weather warnings and weather forecasts. So that will be an almost instantaneous degradation of service. In the long run, compromising more broadly uh, are the integrity and the temporal contiguity of our observational network will make it very difficult to do longer term climate assessments, because what you really need is an uninterrupted record. As soon as you start to have a significant amount of missing data, it becomes really difficult to maintain the integrity of those data sets and assess long term trends. So then that becomes an additional problem. But specifically with radiosondes and also things like weather radar, the danger to the public begins to accrue within minutes to hours of that happening. So this is my point that I made in my statement. If we move fast and break this with the plan of fixing it a few weeks, a few months, or a few years from now, we are left completely vulnerable in the meantime to whatever Mother Nature or global warming or whatever it is throws at us. And that's not a very comforting thought. So there's another comment from Dr. Paige Hull. Hopefully I got that name right. But Paige remarks that another recent PhD here, my NOAA position was rescinded late January during the hiring freeze. So this is an additional thing that's happened in addition to the firings that are occurring now, in addition to the reduction in force, the much larger reduction in force that might still be forthcoming. In addition to the hiring freeze, they can't hire new people. There were a number of people who were made initial offers in late 2024 and early 2025 who were in the process of being onboarded, who never even made it into the office and never were able to do any productive work for the federal government because they were let go before they even were able to walk through the front door, quite literally. So I'm sorry to hear that. And I know you mentioned that you feel like there aren't other options. And I hopefully I've offered some useful tidbits above, but right now I think everyone is still sort of scrambling, and I'll continue to revisit that in the days and weeks to come. So let's see. Well, yeah, I'm really sorry to hear that, folks. And there's a number of people who have reflected on their own role in everything that's happening. All right, so I'm continuing. There's been a lot of comments today, folks. I'm just trying to catch up as I read through here. So I know there are a number of journalists on this call, and I know there are a lot of journalists who really would like to speak directly with people at NOAA or NWS who have been fired or who have information about those who have been. I'm not a journalist, although sometimes I play one on TV, I guess, but uh, ultimately, I would strongly suggest reaching out to the journalists who I have retweeted or reposted on Twitter or X, as it now is, or Blue Sky or elsewhere, as well as the ones who've responded to the threads that I've recently posted on those networks. If you are willing to speak on or off the record, and I know a lot of journalists are happy to speak off the record even through secure messaging platforms like Signal. Check out those threads to figure out who you should be contacting. And there's a lot of interest in first person narratives as to what your personal experience has been. And I really do think that one of the most constructive things that folks who have been affected can do in this moment, if you have the bandwidth, is to speak with journalists so that the fuller picture becomes more widely known about what's happening. All right, so just reviewing the last tranche of comments to come in here. All right, well, I think I've made it through most of the comments here. So I just wanted to say once again that if you've been directly affected, I'm sorry, and I do know a growing number of people who have been. In fact, I would expect that my email inbox will probably be full of messages by the time I end this live session. I am trying to keep touch with the journalists who would like to speak right now. Please refer to this live session if you want audio or video. I also sent out my statement with reading it. I only noticed 2 or 3 typos, which I guess is not bad given it was essentially a stream of consciousness in 20 minutes. And please refer to that statement or the threaded version of it on various social media sites. I don't necessarily have a lot of additional factual, quantitative information about the scope or scale of the firings beyond what is reported publicly at the moment. So, but the biggest request I'm getting from journalists right now are for people who are willing to speak to them on or off the record to either reach out via their email or via their secure messaging identities on platforms like Signal or something like that. All right. Well, the last thing I guess I'll mention is directly about the weather in California. And it has been an extraordinarily warm winter day in California, as was well advertised in advance by your favorite local National Weather Service office. In fact, some places in California, especially the northern end of the Sacramento Valley near Shasta, and even a couple of spots in far southern California, saw either nearly or perhaps singularly their hottest February day on record today. So remarkable, remarkable warmth once again at an unusual time of year. That is going to fade away as a wetter pattern returns to most of California, fortunately. So if this pattern were to continue indefinitely, we would see a reemergence of major fire risk in Southern California. But fortunately, it does look like it's going to rain, at least decently, even in Southern California in the days to come. I'll have more to say about that next week, as well as on social media over the weekend. So just trying to keep up with everything here. But I'll be back to the weather next week. I may need to do another session about what's going on with NOAA and the Weather Service, but I think we need to be able to, as they used to say, walk and chew gum at the same time. And so thank you for joining me. I know that a lot of folks don't like to hear me talk about what's going on in the federal government, but I really do think it's important and critically important to engage with it, even if for the solely self-interested reason of being able to continue to have these conversations about weather and climate, which is now seriously in jeopardy just based on what's happening around us at the moment. So again, thank you for your attention. Thank you for watching. If you're watching because I'm talking about what's going on with NOAA and the Weather Service, thank you for watching. If you're watching despite the fact that I'm talking about what's going on at NOAA and the National Weather Service, I'll be following this pretty continuously online. You can see my thoughts on social media as they evolve. Otherwise, thanks for joining, and I'll talk to you all again soon.